In this short discussion, we will highlight some of the things that the book talks about in regards to climate change. We'll also look at some stabilizing selection effects. So the book gives a couple of examples of how a rapidly evolving character like coat color, and in mammals, coat color refers to both the skin and the hair. By the way, most of the time, just so you know, in mammals, this is not always the case. But in many cases, the skin underneath, the pigmentation patterns in the skin, match the coat color. So it's just an upregulation of melanin in that area of the skin. So for example, if you shave a tiger bald, it will still have stripes, but you'll see the stripes on the skin rather than the hair. But that's not true in every case. For instance, in rabbits, they are able to regulate the amount of melanin in their hair. And I actually don't know for sure, but I don't think the skin shows the fluctuations in melanin color that you see in the hair. I would guess with the mice here that you would also see that regional variation in melanin both at the skin level and in the hair level. But for many mammals, it's the hair that's the visible part. So that's going to be the part that natural selection works strongest on. And so in this mouse example, it's a very famous example where we can see very strong selection depending on the substrate on which the mice are living. In areas where there's very light colored substrate along beaches, we tend to have very light colored mice. But the main population on the inland, it has a very dark color because of the darker, there's more organic material in the soil, it's browner soil. And so the large population tends to have a brown one. And so whether or not these are different species or subspecies is still debatable, and people are working on that. But we can see fairly strong selection in these very small populations that are branching off from the main population. And so where we have this variation in the environment, still within a range the mice are able to survive in, but with a critical important difference, in this case, the substrate color. We see lots and lots of variability, and probably even what we would call convergence, right? Where they probably all started from this ancestral population, and now they look similar due to similar natural selection pressures in those beach environments. And we can also see temporal variation, and this is very rapid temporal variation where we go back and forth from one season to the next. And the snowshoe hare in the summer has a dark coat, and in the winter, in most of its range, has a very light, almost completely white coat, and that helps it survive. So that's a seasonal variation, and that's maintained by genetic diversity in the genome. But even within that long range, as we are seeing warmer and warmer climates and changes in precipitation, there are some areas that are having less snowfall. And so there's been good indication that in certain areas that the darker morph, that a rare mutant that maintains the darker coat throughout the year may be actually doing better now because of reduction in snowpack. And so we might see northern populations that still maintain the historical change between the seasons, and southern populations that maybe shift towards more of a year-round dark coat. So again, variation and variability, they're going to be interbreeding with one another, so it's a very complex story. Additionally, another wrinkle to this story, which was kind of a cool discovery, was that the snowshoe hare is not completely separated from jackrabbit populations, and in parts of their range they overlap. So their closest relative are the jackrabbits. Jackrabbits stay brown all year long. And when they traced and were able to identify the gene causing the year-long dark coat in the snowshoe hares, they realized that it was a gene that had moved over from the jackrabbit population. Probably very rarely, there are individuals that are able to breed and leave behind offspring, and some of those alleles made it into the snowshoe hare population, and because they're beneficial in that area, they've been kept and become more and more and more common. So that's a good vocabulary word. I think we've already talked about it. If not, it's a good vocabulary word to learn. Let's write it down here. When there is very rare interbreeding between two populations, and the possibility of alleles to move from one population to the other, we call that introgression. So introgression is the movement of alleles from one population into another. We talked about introgression with regards to human and Neanderthal, like Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis populations. And so introgression is possible when there is very rare interbreeding between populations. If interbreeding is much, much more common, then the two populations just meld into one unidentifiable, unseparable population, right? That there are no identifiable subspecies within the population as breeding becomes more and more common. But if breeding is very, very rare, those populations maintain their separate identities, maybe even as easily defined species. However, it leaves the door open for rare movement of alleles from one population to a next, and particularly if there is strong natural selection for one of those, then we would see the increase in the frequency of that introgressed allele. Now, one other major climate issue I want to talk about here, and we're going to do this in rather broad details. I'll get rid of that. That should be on the next slide. But it's an important one because of the massive anthropogenic climate changes that we are facing. Anthropogenic means human-caused, and there are many, many, many of these. Some are more regional, but there are now global anthropogenic climate change, right? As global temperatures rise, primarily because of the release of carbon dioxide and the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we see changes in the natural selection of species, okay? And so this is more of a global climate change, right? A climate trend across the entire globe. But regional climates have always had impacts. And climate trends have been massive and varied throughout the history of the Earth. We've had periods of time that we call snowball Earth, where for millions of years the Earth was basically covered in snow, basically frozen, and then warming periods. And those are often due to environmental factors on Earth. Sometimes they're due to forces in the solar system based on how hot the sun is or how close the Earth was to the sun, because there has been historically, and is to some extent today, some variation in that. But as near as we can tell, the vast majority of very recent changes over the last 4 or 5 decades are due primarily to human activities, the burning of fossil fuels and other activities that release greenhouse gases, I guess is the best term for them, right? Carbon dioxide. Methane is a very, very strong greenhouse gas, but is not released when we burn things. It's released through accidentally in drilling, or released organically from cows. And as we have more and more cows, we get more methane. So there are a number of considerations, but the main one seems to be our burning of fossil fuels, the release of carbon dioxide, and its buildup in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is on a global cycle. It's taken up by plants, sequestered in their bodies, and then if those plants are somehow preserved, like in coal deposits, or we have plankton that also is photosynthetic, takes up large amounts of carbon dioxide, then settles to the bottom of the ocean and is set down. But those rates of uptake remain relatively flat. But our rate of releasing it, all those stored carbon dioxide stored in oil, stored in coal, we've been releasing them at much higher rates than has ever happened before, and certainly in human history, and maybe even historically, that we've kind of tipped the balance of the carbon cycle. And so as carbon builds up, we expect global temperatures to rise. And so there have been many recent reports that they are changing so quickly, and that's the main thing, right? What happens when climate changes quickly? And it really doesn't matter. It's not that getting warm is bad. Getting cold is not bad. Like I say, the Earth has gotten warmer and colder many, many times over Earth's history. The main issue for concern with anthropogenic climate change is the rate of change. And again, it's over a relatively small sample size, but the trends are not looking good. We are continuing to burn more and more fossil fuels. The Earth is getting warmer and warmer. And so when the climate changes too quickly, no matter what that change is, then many species are not going to be able to adapt. And so the faster the change, the more drastic the change, the fewer species are going to be able to adapt to that change. And we talked about how extinction is simply failure to adapt to a changing environment, right? And so if we get a massively, rapidly changing environment, then fewer species are going to be able to adapt. And so there is much concern because of the rapid, in just 2 or 3 decades, we have dramatically begun to impact the temperature of the Earth. And if that trend continues, right, who knows, well, that's hard to predict. Human technology is getting better. We're becoming more aware, maybe gaining the political and individual will to reduce climate change. So perhaps the trend is just a little blip and we'll be able to stabilize it. But if the trend continues, we're going to see continued pressure on species and more extinctions. Now, in many cases, when organisms are faced with an environment, there are opposing forces. And your book looks at this fun example of gall flies. Gall flies reproduce by laying an egg in a plant, and many of them are very specialized. You can see if you go outside and look at live oak leaves, you'll often see many, many galls that are caused by insects ovipositing into those, a different species than we have the one in your book, the one that we're going to talk about. But these lay their eggs on a small plant called goldenrod, and then the plant has almost like an immune response, and it builds up tissue to protect itself from that invasion, the egg that's been laid inside. And it helps the plant to survive, but it also provides some protection for the developing larva from the outside environment. But the door swings both ways. And what I mean by that is if the gall gets very, very large, then bird predators, woodpeckers in particular, will be able to notice them, and very easily they can break into it and steal that embryo or the larva. So too large is not very good because birds will eat them. However, if the gall is too small, then the parasitoid wasps, which look for these eggs and lay their eggs on them, and then the developing wasp will eat the fly larva. If it's too small, it's much easier for the ovipositors to access the larva. So too small, you get eaten by wasp larvae, parasitoids. Too large, and you get eaten by birds, the predators. And so there's kind of this medium that is going to be best for the flies. And so natural selection eliminates the small galls, eliminates the large galls. And in your book, it talks about the research that the people did to determine that, yes, it is determined by the fly and not as much the plant. There might be some plant input, but the fly itself also has chemicals that are deposited with the egg that determine the overall size of the gall. And so this is called stabilizing selection. And many times stabilizing selection is basically the same overall force on both sides. For instance, human birth. It's not good to be large because you don't survive the birth process. It's not good to be very, very small because you have decreased chance of survival. So that's kind of on both sides. There's this kind of happy medium or best average size for survival of a human fetus when it's basically a human child when it's born. There's kind of this optimal size. You can do all right if you're a little bigger or a little smaller, but if you go too far on either side, the natural selection begins to weed out. And so when there is a genetic or a series of genetic traits that are determining the phenotype, and selection is working on both sides, we tend to have this balancing or what is called stabilizing selection, and we end up somewhere around the mean. Now, if environment changes, so if birds became less common, then we might see a shift towards the smaller sized galls because overall they would do better. But as long as that pressure is on both sides, we're going to stay right there stabilized around what the average is.